scarce enough to trade as currency and foreign ships could tip the balance of power between warring chiefs, the Pacific was less an ocean than an open market for whoever arrived armed and ambitious enough to press an advantage. Chapter 4. Reef, Radar and Metcalfe's Revenge opens on the waters off Oʻahu, where a day of exceptional snorkeling at Hanauma Bay and a drive past a Cold War-era radar platform perched on a retired oil rig frame, a place still shaped by the logic of strategic position and outside reach. That same logic haunted the islands in the late 1700s, when trader Simon Metcalfe turned a stolen piece of ship metal and a dead watchman into a massacre at Olowalu, and set off a chain of retaliation that would cost him everything, including a son he never knew was already gone. I discovered quickly that looking backward at the complex legacy of Captain Cook, as I had done the previous evening, serves as poor preparation for the immediate reality of looking downward at a parrotfish. The great explorers of the 18th century navigated by the stars and the swell of the sea, whereas I navigated by a plastic-encased cell phone and the desperate hope that my snorkel mask would maintain its vacuum seal. We launched our aquatic campaign at Hanauma Bay, and if I may speak with the unearned confidence of a seasoned admiral, it was a triumph. The snorkeling was hands down the finest I have ever experienced in this particular crater. The biodiversity on display was staggering, featuring massive specimens and great schools of fish swimming in such precise formation that I suspected they were drilling for a hostile takeover of the reef. After surviving the mild perils of the deep, we secured a burger that was, in technical terms, excellent. The drive from the bay back to the resort offered a view of the SBX-1, a massive X-band radar perched atop a retired oil platform. It is a jarring aesthetic choice. The piece of high-tech surveillance floats innocently off the coast like a villain's hideout from a Connery-era Bond film waiting for the budget to be approved. It sits there watching the horizon while tourists drive past in rented convertibles, completely oblivious to its silent vigil. Dinner was executed at Mina's Fish House, which proved to be fantastic, a culinary victory worthy of song. Following the meal, we embarked on a sentimental pilgrimage to the specific stretch of sand where we were married 15 years ago. Nature, perhaps sensing the anniversary, provided a rare viewing of monk seals lounging on the beach. I had never seen them at this location before. They lay there like discarded fur-covered duffel bags, entirely unimpressed by the significance of the shoreline to our personal history. We continued our walk around the resort, though my mood was dampened by the recollection that the hammerhead sharks are gone from the ponds at the former J.W. Marriott footprint. The absence of these predators, replaced now with domesticated koi, makes the space feel sanitized. It is far less wild, as if the resort has been baby-proofed for the comfort of people who prefer their nature strictly decorative. It is baffling to observe the logistical paradoxes of this island. The locals reside on a landmass so small it barely registers on a globe, yet traversing it requires a level of patience usually reserved for monks. The traffic crawling from Ko Olina back to Honolulu at 5 in the morning is a humanitarian crisis. Without congestion, the drive is a mere hour. With it, one ages significantly. It is also fascinating to witness how the local population has enthusiastically imported mainland truck culture. Jacked-up F350s are ubiquitous here. I found myself asking a question that has plagued philosophers for ages. Does one truly need a monster truck to conquer the rugged terrain of a Costco parking lot? I am fairly certain there are more lifted trucks here than in Tennessee, a statistic that frankly defies the laws of geography. The sky has maintained a stubborn overcast gloom lately, a grey ceiling that turns the water a peculiar milky blue but offers a merciful reprieve from the solar radiation. Under this muted light, the Japanese tourists have returned in force. We watched them swinging clubs at the private golf course, a scene that triggered a distinct sense of déjà vu. It felt like a flashback to the late 80s and early 90s, an era of acute economic anxiety when American pop culture was convinced Japan would purchase the entire planet. We got cinematic masterpieces like Rising Sun and the corporate setting for Die Hard out of that panic. Now, watching the methodical swings on the fairway, it seems the only thing being conquered is a high handicap. The sharp geopolitical anxieties of past eras fade predictably enough, leaving behind imported habits and the quiet persistence of everyday leisure. São Miguel, prayer powered by Malasadas. Dietary abstinence is historically presented as a solemn period of spiritual reflection. In practice, however, an impending 40-day religious fast operates as the universal signal for a frantic, sugar-fueled pantry liquidation. Driving past the coastal golf courses under the milky canopy of clouds we had observed from the balcony, we navigated our way back to the room and spotted the modern descendant of that frantic liquidation parked by the road. It was a Malasada food truck. Malasadas are a beloved fried pastry in Hawaii, originally introduced by Portuguese immigrants who arrived primarily from the Azores and Madeira. These settlers began coming to the islands in 1878 to work as contract laborers on the booming sugar plantations, bringing their families, their Catholic faith, and their culinary expertise. The custom of making malasadas began in parish kitchens as a strictly practical operation to use up rich ingredients like sugar and butter just before Lent. Over the generations, a specific religious requirement evolved into a widespread local comfort food. Today, this sugary legacy is honored on Malasada Day, an annual event celebrated widely across the islands on Shrove Tuesday. Observing that truck triggered a memory of São Miguel. We had managed to arrive in the Azores exactly at the beginning of Lent, a season that usually brings to mind grim faces and the forced surrender of perfectly good snacks. The pastry serves a deeper purpose than tropical recreation, functioning directly as a mechanism of tectonic diplomacy. Our previous exploration of regional history, a subject I documented thoroughly in my book Piri Piri to the Eye, a cautionary tale of Lisbon and São Miguel, took us to the Igreja de Nossa Senhora de Ajuda. Put up in the 1500s, this church was knocked flat by an earthquake and stubbornly rebuilt in the 1800s. It was a structure encompassing a profound reluctance to relocate. That stubbornness seemed appropriate for Lent, which is fundamentally about sticking things out. Speaking of sticking it out, we started noticing packs of men marching everywhere during that trip. They wore matching checkered shawls, swung rosaries like tiny censers, and moved with the grim determination of a highly devoted hiking group that had miscalculated the distance to its destination. These were the Romeiros, or pilgrims. Back in 1522, Villafranca do Campo got walloped by an earthquake, and the survivors figured a long penitential walk might persuade the management upstairs to go easier on the fault lines next time. Centuries later, groups of 30 to 200 men still execute this strategy. For 8 straight days from sunup to sundown, they march clockwise around the whole island to visit over 100 churches and chapels. They chant, they pray, and they look collectively like they could really use an adjustable bed and several gallons of coffee. Kind souls along the route provide them with nightly food and lodging. It is remarkably hospitable, although one does have to wonder if the hosts lock up their expensive linens beforehand. Just reading their schedule made my own feet ache sympathetically. Returning to the road, we realized their march provided a highly audible protest against future tremors. Their hymns bounced around the valleys and drifted along the coast, creating a roving, pious soundtrack. The effect was impressive, but also slightly unnerving, like suddenly realizing a choir has been following you for 3 miles. Fortunately, the Azorians possess practical souls and grasp that 40 days of intense piety require a preliminary caloric reinforcement. Faith is admirable, but so is fried dough. The pastry resembles a donut, but one far less worried about its figure. It is fried gold with crisp edges and a cloud-like middle, dusted liberally with sugar. The official explanation maintains they were invented to cleverly use up all the lard and waste nothing, a justification that made them remarkably easy to locate. We wandered into a local shop, lured by the unmistakable aroma of frying dough hanging heavily in the air. The owner, a woman who had spent time in Boston and thus understood the universal appeal of things both fried and sweet, was serving up fresh malasadas. "This," she informed us with a knowing wink, holding up a sugar-dusted piece of heaven, "is our way of making Lent a little sweeter." It was an impossibly easy concept to embrace. Biting into a warm one felt less like penance and more like a reward for being physically close to someone else's penance. Sweetened by this theological loophole, the entire phenomenon of the Romeiros became instantly coherent. Their epic stroll acts as both earthquake insurance and personal soul-searching. It functions as history on foot, providing a living demonstration of faith hardened by centuries on volcanic soil surrounded by a vast ocean. Men depend completely on strangers for nightly room and board, connecting neighbors tightly with every shared meal. The songs transfer from mouth to ear across generations, establishing a unique strand of cultural memory. These long-distance walkers in their shawls, powered by prayer and neighborly kindness, maintain a rhythm of serious devotion heavily insulated by pragmatic deliciousness. Outside the Hawaiian food truck, a sudden gust of wind caught a discarded pastry wrapper, scattering a fine white drift of sugar across the dark asphalt as we retreated to our room, leaving the local theology outside and turning instead to the screen. Chief of War, Hawaiian Blood and Iron. Leaving the sugary fallout of the local theology behind, we retreated to the air-conditioned sanctuary of our room to engage with a more contemporary, streamable form of island violence. We queued up Jason Momoa's miniseries on Apple TV, Chief of War. It is loosely surreal to chart the trajectory of Momoa's career. I remember watching him years ago in Stargate Atlantis, running around a Canadian forest pretending to be an alien warlord. I never would have predicted the guy from the sci-fi cable Deep Cuts would become the massive movie star he is today. But he is clearly deeply invested in this project, essentially willing this historical epic into existence through sheer charisma and eyebrow talk. The actual history lurking behind the high-definition bloodshed, however, is far more compelling than the show itself. The period between the death of Captain James Cook in 1779 and the arrival of Simon Metcalfe roughly a decade later was not a quiet intermission. Instead, it was a frantic era defined by the rapid integration of Hawaiʻi into the global maritime fur trade, the militarization of island chiefdoms, and the rise of an iron-based economy. Following Cook's demise at Kealakekua Bay, there was a brief lull in contact, a sort of geopolitical awkward silence until the 1784 publication of his journals in Europe. These accounts revealed a decisive detail. Sea otter pelts obtained on the northwest coast of America could be sold in Canton for massive profit margins. That market intelligence transformed Hawaiʻi from a scientific curiosity into a strategic logistical hub. By 1786, Captains Nathaniel Portlock and George Dixon, veterans of Cook's voyages who clearly knew a good business opportunity when they saw one, arrived to establish the islands as an essential pit stop for provisions before the long run to China. This emerging routine generated a dark paradox. The tools meant to build ships and settlements were used to purchase the supplies that would tear the existing social order apart. Early traders established a habit of bartering iron for water, wood, pork and salt. The average iron nail became the undisputed hard currency of the late 18th century, possessing immense practical utility. It was valued highly for crafting fishhooks and functional tools, driving an intense trade that unfortunately included the exchange of sexual services for metal, a dynamic that began with Cook but became deeply entrenched by the late 1780s. Hawaiian chiefs were not passive observers of this industrial influx. They actively sought to leverage foreign power for local dominance. High Chief Kaiana provides the clearest example. In 1787, Kaiana boarded the British ship Nootka under Captain John Meares at Kauai and travelled to Canton, likely becoming the first Hawaiian chief to visit China. He returned in 1788 aboard the Iphigenia with stories of foreign lands alongside a heavy cargo of trade goods, weapons, and gunpowder. Kaiana settled on Hawaii Island and allied with Kamehameha I, who was then consolidating power. Kaiana's foreign experience and new arsenal made him a formidable military asset, signaling a shift where local chiefs raced to master Western military technology with immediate, pragmatic ruthlessness. While foreigners dropped anchor in the bays, the internal political landscape fractured into violent competition. By the 1780s, Kahekili II, the king of Maui, had become a dominant force controlling Maui, Molokai, Lanai, and Oʻahu. Simultaneously, Kamehameha I was engaged in wars to unite the districts of Hawaii Island. It was during this localized violence that the incident inspiring the law of the splintered paddle, or Kanawai Mamalaho, occurred. During a raid in Puna, Kamehameha's foot was caught in a reef. A fisherman seized the opportunity and struck him over the head with a paddle. Kamehameha survived the blow. Rather than seeking vengeance, he later used the event to proclaim a 1797 decree protecting non-combatants from unprovoked attacks, providing a surprisingly rare historical instance of a concussion leading directly to a breakthrough in human rights law. Back in the hotel room, the on-screen representation of this nuanced era began to lose its footing. The series features a final battle sequence that abandons tension for absurd violence, devolving into a video game cutscene without the controller. Despite the gratuitous blood, the real anchors of the show were the Hawaiian actresses. Though largely unfamiliar to mainland audiences, they did a fantastic job carrying the emotional weight of a script that frankly preferred decapitation to dialogue. By the time the credit sequence rolled, the show had introduced a sequence involving innocent Hawaiians that serves as a catalyst for future conflict, centering on a man named Simon Metcalfe. Watching the fictionalized version swing his weight around the Pacific, one naturally wonders about the reality of the figure. History suggests Simon Metcalfe was a maritime fur trader, a master of logistics, a supplier of arms, a violator of treaties, and a New Yorker, a geographic origin that frankly explains much of the unprovoked aggression. Simon Metcalfe, From Frontiers to Fur Seas. Yet as compelling as Jason Momoa's grimace is in Chief of War, portraying Simon Metcalfe merely as a caricature of colonial malice misses the strange, bureaucratic tragedy of the man. Before he was a Pacific marauder or a plot device for streaming drama, Metcalfe was a guy from London who simply liked measuring things. Born in 1741 near the shipping district of the city, he migrated to New York in the mid-1760s. He arrived not with a sword, but with the tools of a surveyor. It was a profession requiring a level of fastidious precision, usually reserved for diamond cutters or people who organize their spice racks alphabetically. In colonial New York, Metcalfe successfully monetized his obsession with straight lines. He helped trace the Fort Stanwix Treaty Line and established himself as a frontier entrepreneur on the Missisquoi River. He ran a trading post there that acted as a crossroads economy, shipping lumber and fish toward the West Indies and tapping into Abenaki trade networks. He even secured a royal land grant for a massive tract called Prattsburg near Lake Champlain. The name sounds less like a wilderness empire and more like an accounting firm in a regional strip mall. I attempted to verify the exact coordinates of this lost fiefdom from the comfort of my balcony at the Four Seasons. The quest for knowledge felt appropriately academic until the hotel Wi-Fi abruptly vanished. For a solid minute, I held my tablet aloft in the cool evening air. I sat paralyzed by a spinning loading icon while the Pacific Ocean roared indifferently below. Losing a signal in paradise halts impromptu mapping projects. But my temporary struggle with a router was undeniably softer than what Metcalfe was about to endure. During the Revolutionary War, he defied the basic logic of self-preservation and supplied continental forces during the invasion of Canada. This decision provoked a catastrophic response. British troops leveled his buildings. They held Metcalfe prisoner in Canada for 9 months. His wife, Catherine, and their 8 children were detained as hostages until the war concluded in 1783. Peace brought litigation rather than comfort. Upon his release, Metcalfe found his Prattsburg estate in ruins and his legal standing vaporized. He spent years in Albany filing petitions to Congress for navigation rights on the St. Lawrence River. He argued endlessly with Vermont authorities who refused to recognize his New York land patents. He found himself utterly ruined. He was broke, landless, and stranded in a bureaucracy that preferred to ignore him. Realizing he had no future pulling profits from the soil, he pivoted his ambitions to the water. He acquired the brig Eleanora, ready to trade the rigid, disputed boundaries of the frontier for the boundless and violent indifference of the sea. Simon Metcalfe sails into the China trade. My own current expedition involves navigating the high-stakes geopolitical landscape of an Apple TV remote in a climate-controlled hotel suite, but as I toggle between episodes of Chief of War, I find myself retracing Simon Metcalfe's far more arduous pivot from ruined land surveyor to maritime speculator. Departing New York Harbor on February 18, 1787, he took command of the brig Eleanora with aggressive ambition. He intended to force his way into maritime records as the first American captain to breach the Indian Ocean fur and sealing trades. The voyage was a logistical odyssey plotted more by a desperate need to stay solvent than by reliable navigation. His route sliced southward through the Indian Ocean, where he etched his name into the annals of petty distinctions by becoming the first American to attempt sealing on the desolation of Kerguelen Island. As I sit on my balcony debating whether to walk 3 minutes to the restaurant for cheesecake, I am struck by the sheer grit required to handle Metcalfe's provisioning crisis in the Comoros. Upon reaching the island of Moheli, the crew discovered their water supplies had turned stale and putrid, a tasting note rarely found on the sommelier's list at the Four Seasons. They paused to trade for bananas and oranges. Metcalfe transformed this basic necessity into a makeshift seamanship seminar. He used the calm passage toward India to drill his men on the finer points of not sinking. Arrival in Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, presented a diplomatic hurdle that no amount of fruit could bridge. Anchoring at Trincomalee, Metcalfe found himself under the microscope of Dutch officials. These administrators viewed the new rebel colonies, the United States, with intense suspicion born of fiercely guarded shipping monopolies. International bureaucracy is frequently scaled by the judicious application of alcohol. Metcalfe bypassed a formal treaty entirely, dissolving the tension by gifting a keg of Madeira wine to the customs officer. This strategic lubricant secured him safe passage alongside a Dutch convoy heading to the Coromandel coast. The Eleanora eventually sailed alone across the Bay of Bengal. Pulling an escort up the Hooghly River to Calcutta, Metcalfe was fated as the master of the first American vessel to visit the port. Despite the recent violence of the Revolutionary War, the British East India Company servants welcomed him willingly, largely because they were eager to circumvent their own corporate trading restrictions. In a stroke of improbable networking luck, he struck up a bond with a local merchant named Major Thomas Theophilus Metcalfe, forging a friendship based entirely on the coincidence of sharing a surname. By August 1787, Metcalfe had reached Macau. He positioned himself at the very edge of the Celestial Empire, just as the market began to violently shift beneath his feet. He spent the remainder of the year observing the outfitting of John Meares's expedition and watching Captains Portlock and Dixon roll into town with a massive haul of over 2,500 sea otter skins. Standing along the harbour and watching the heavy cargo being unloaded, he realized the astronomical profits lay in harvesting pelts rather than carrying standard goods. Bandwagons are frequently sneered at by those who pride themselves on originality and independent thought. Strategic realignment, however, was the only force driving Simon Metcalfe. Witnessing the sudden wealth of his peers, he discarded his previous plans for the Indian Ocean and set his sights firmly on the northwest coast. Simon Metcalfe and Hawaii's ill-fated wake. Pausing the digital carnage of Chief of War to look out over the dark water beyond Ko Olina, I find that moving from stylized television violence to the dry historical record of Simon Metcalfe requires a mental shift back to the terrifying reality of 18th-century logistics. Having discarded his original plans to pursue the northwest coast fur trade, Metcalfe spent the early months of 1788 lurking in the Pearl River Delta. He was engaged in a time-honored maritime tradition, waiting for others to do the hard work so he could copy them. He studied John Meares fitting out the Felice Adventurer and Iphigenia Nubiana with the intense scrutiny of a rival merchant. When Meares finally departed on January 22, 1788, Metcalfe took his cue. Steering the Eleanora out of Chinese waters, he vanished into the foggy void of the North Pacific. He left behind no logbook, yet he eventually returned with a phantom cargo suggesting he learned exactly where the pelt fortunes lay. It was on the return leg of this coastal run, around June or July of 1788, that he stumbled into a distinction usually reserved for captains with better publicists. Desperate to water and provision the Eleanora before crossing back to China, he anchored in Hawaii. If the timeline holds, this pit stop made Simon Metcalfe the first American captain to visit the Hawaiian Islands, beating Robert Gray by a full year. We tend to imagine such historical firsts as solemn tableaus, with breathless explorers planting flags and exchanging profound greetings with indigenous royalty. The actual machinery of this event, however, was powered entirely by the urgent need to preserve rotting meat. Metcalfe was not composing speeches for posterity. He was preoccupied with salting down spare pork before the tropical heat turned his hold into a biological hazard. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the Hawaiians sent 3 young women aboard. The captain had previously demanded strict shipboard security, but his crew promptly lowered ropes to smuggle up 3 more. Metcalfe stormed about the deck, shouting at his men and threatening mutiny charges, yet his absolute authority had hit a wall against the crew's sudden enthusiasm. He settled for ordering a meticulous search of the visitors. This proved a task of comedic redundancy. The women were clad only in traditional bark cloth and flowers, and they laughed uproariously as the sailors attempted to conduct a security pat-down on practically bare skin. The captain eventually surrendered to the inevitable and allowed the same 6 women to return each evening, though he noted with weary cynicism that his son, Thomas, had developed a severe obsession with the youngest visitor, a spirited girl of 16. The elder Metcalfe dismissed the affair as calf love and offered Thomas a grim history lesson instead. He warned the boy that these were the very same smiling people who had allegedly murdered Captain Cook with his own trade daggers just 9 years earlier. Thomas, lost in the throes of teenage infatuation, ignored his father's lectures on the geopolitical consequences of indigenous relations. By August 1788, the Eleanora was back in Canton. The northwest coast run had proven successful enough to justify an aggressive expansion of the family business. Seeking a secondary vessel for his next fur trading venture, Metcalfe used his profits to purchase a small schooner in Macau. He christened the new boat the Fair American and placed his love-struck son Thomas in command. It was a decision that set the board for their return to the fur trade, proving that while Simon Metcalfe could navigate the treacherous waters of the Pacific, he was about to learn that running a family business is a sink-or-swim proposition, schooner or later. Broken compass to Nootka, Metcalfe adrift. A supplemental schooner purchased in the humid heat of Macau might have seemed like a brilliant expansion of the family business in late 1788. Handing the helm of such a toy boat to an 18-year-old for a North Pacific crossing, however, suggested a level of parental optimism bordering on criminal negligence. The Fair American was comically diminutive, a mere 26 tons of timber that sat so low in the water the crew could practically wash their hands in the ocean without bending over. It was a design feature charming in a protected marina, but deeply unsettling in a typhoon. The low profile served as a grim reminder that while ocean swells easily lift a vessel, they also routinely swallow the small ones. In May 1789, Simon and Thomas Metcalf departed China intending to sail in tandem to Nootka Sound. The ocean immediately registered its objection to this plan. A violent storm severed the visual link between the father's brig, the Eleanora, and Thomas's glorified yacht. This left the teenager alone in the vast, indifferent emptiness of the Pacific. To compound the disaster, the schooner's sole compass shattered, stripping Thomas of the ability to sail a direct route. Mechanical failure transformed a difficult voyage into a navigational trap, forcing the boy to abandon the open water and hug the volatile rim of the basin where he could steer by sight. Thomas was effectively forced to navigate by relying on the Ring of Fire skirting the coasts of Japan, the Kurile Islands, and the Aleutians. This path required him to sail agonizingly close to Tokugawa, Japan, a nation officially closed to foreigners and known to view uninvited visitors with lethal suspicion. Unable to land, Thomas used the high, smoking peaks of the archipelago as visual handrails. He corrected his latitude by the sun and his longitude by the presence of terrifying volcanoes. I struggled to confirm if sailing a pleasure craft by looking for exploding mountains was a recognized maritime strategy. The crossing was brutal, yet shockingly fast. On July 17, 1789, just 42 days after disappearing from the Chinese coast, the Fair American limped into the Russian outpost at Unalaska. The Russian commander, Potap Zykov, likely looked at the starving crew and their splintered boat with the bewildered pity an admiral might offer a child wandering a battlefield, providing them with dried fish and flour to keep them alive. From there, Thomas dragged his tattered vessel south to Dixon Entrance, where he briefly encountered the American trader John Kendrick. Kendrick warned him that Nootka Sound was currently a zone of Spanish aggression. With a sprung mast and a crew running on fumes, Thomas had no real choice but to sail directly into the conflict. When the Fair American finally stumbled into Nootka Sound in October 1789, Thomas sailed straight into a geopolitical trap. The Spanish commander Esteban José Martínez, who was in the process of asserting Madrid's dominance over the entire coastline, promptly seized the vessel. He noted with bureaucratic disdain that the boy arrived without a passport, without written instructions, and possessing no papers other than a diary. The Spanish presence at Nootka was a militarized enforcement of a global decree that viewed any unauthorized vessel as a direct threat to the Catholic monarchy and a precursor to intercontinental war. Yet, behind the imperial posturing, Martinez was genuinely impressed that the young captain had managed to sail a bathtub 3,000 leagues without drowning. Nootka Sound, fair American and fatherly flight. Despite any begrudging respect for the boy's survival, the geopolitical trap closed entirely once the schooner stopped moving. While I generally consider a missing hotel reservation to be a diplomatic crisis, Thomas faced the actual Nootka crisis, a heavy-breathing face-off between the British and Spanish empires for control of the Pacific Northwest. Martinez initially extended a polite invitation to moor at Friendly Cove, a name that turned out to be ironic in the extreme. Once the anchor was down, the Spanish commander dropped the pleasantries and seized the vessel. The official charge was illegal entry, which felt rich considering Madrid claimed ownership of the entire Pacific Ocean. Thomas, having barely survived a solo crossing that would make Odysseus look like a commuter, presented the only documentation he had: a personal diary. The Spanish Empire, acting as a citadel of pedantry, was entirely unimpressed by his journaling habits. Citing a lack of United States registry, Martinez ordered the arrest of the young crew and arranged for their transport south to the Naval Department at San Blas, Mexico. The capture proved that even in the 18th century, the greatest threat to a traveler was not scurvy or storms, but a bureaucrat with a quota. The situation descended into tragic farce on Halloween, October 31st, 1789. Just as Martinez was preparing to tow his new prize away, sails appeared on the horizon. It was Simon Metcalf arriving in the large brig Eleonora. The father sailed blithely into the Sound, only to spot his son's tiny schooner sitting under the shadow of a massive, well-armed Spanish warship. It was the maritime equivalent of walking into a room and realizing everyone has stopped talking and is looking at you. The Spanish ship immediately maneuvered to cut Simon off, hoisting its colors and firing a warning shot across his bow. In a frantic exchange of cloth and canvas, Simon raised the American flag. He then brought the Eleonora close enough to see the fair American execute a prearranged signal. Thomas lowered his flag. He had struck his colors. It was a silent, devastating message between father and son that translated roughly to, "I am already caught. Save yourself." Simon Metcalf, a man whose morality seemed as flexible as his navigation charts, made a decision that history records as difficult, and I record as the reason therapy was invented. Realizing that the warning shot was an open invitation to join his son in irons, Simon utilized the brig's superior speed to flee. He turned his back on the captured schooner, preserving his own ship and crew while leaving his teenage son in the grip of the Spanish Navy. Sources say this decision haunted Metcalfe for the rest of his life, though one imagines it was a particularly awkward subject to avoid during family reunions. The Spanish hauled Thomas and his crew down the coast to Mexico, where the wheels of imperial justice turned with their usual rusty screech. Upon reviewing the case, the Spanish governor determined that the captured Americans, unlike the British, were not actually trying to steal the continent. More importantly, they were expensive to feed. He ruled that keeping them was a fiscal liability. Thomas was released and freed to rejoin the Pacific trade routes. The teenager immediately set sail for Hawaii to rendezvous with the father who had left him behind, ensuring their next meeting would carry a fascinating amount of emotional baggage. That impending reunion would also place Simon Metcalf back in Hawaiian waters, where his intense paranoia over ship security was about to trigger a brutally lethal overreaction. Olowalu Massacre: Iron, Blood, and Bones. The elder Metcalfe had fled the frigid geopolitics of the northwest coast for the deceptive warmth of Maui. While his son Thomas was sailing toward a reunion that would never happen, Simon arrived in the islands carrying a merchant captain mentality so rigid it could have been used to calibrate a chronometer. To him, indigenous theft was not a cultural misunderstanding or an expected cost of doing business. It was a cosmic insubordination, a direct challenge to the sanctity of his property that required a response written in gunpowder. The tension aboard the Eleanora was already thick enough to cork the hull. Even before the fatal theft, Metcalfe had dealt with what might be the most optimistic thief in maritime history. A local man had swum to the ship and attempted to pry the copper sheathing off the bottom of the hull with a knife, operating under the physically unsound belief that peeling off the copper would cause the massive brig to instantly sink. Metcalfe, treating the misguided sabotage as a capital offence, fired a pistol at the swimmer, missed, and then captured him. He was fully determined to hang the man from the yardarm. This punishment seemed excessive for an act of premature salvage, and his officers, realizing that executing someone for a poor grasp of buoyancy would only escalate hostilities, persuaded the captain to imprison the man instead. The atmosphere shifted from farce to tragedy over a small boat and a desire for iron nails. Iron was the hard currency of the late 18th century Pacific, highly prized for fashioning fishhooks and awls, and the Eleanora was essentially a floating strongbox. The target of the heist was the ship's cutter, moored at the stern. Guarding it was a sailor from Manila, an older, well-liked man who served as the boat keeper. He wasn't there for tactical supremacy. He was there because the tropical heat below deck was unbearable, and he had requested to sleep in the open air of the small boat to catch a breeze. It was a decision driven by the universal, timeless human need for decent ventilation. Under the cover of darkness, the chief Kaupuiki and his wife, Kalola, who had previously scouted the ship's layout during a friendly visit, led a party to the stern. They cut the mooring rope. As the boat drifted silently away into the shadow of the island, the watchman awoke. Realizing his predicament, he drew his knife and tried to raise the alarm, a lonely shout in the dark that was quickly silenced. He was overpowered and killed, a casualty of the collision between the rigid rules of maritime property and the desperate island demand for iron. Metcalfe's reaction to the theft was an apocalyptic fury. He observed the shore that night and noted that the mountains appeared to be in one continuous blaze, a visual confirmation that the thieves had taken the watchman's body inland and burned it, reportedly as a sacrifice to their gods. The captain, treating the standoff as an active hostage situation rather than a concluded murder, demanded the return of both the man and the boat, offering a reward of a musket and other trade goods. The locals, operating under a protocol Metcalfe could not comprehend, returned only the watchman's thigh bones. It was this grisly restitution that snapped the last tether of Metcalfe's restraint. Standing on the deck of his ship, holding the remains of a crew member who had just wanted a cool place to sleep, he tossed the bones into the sea. Metcalfe's kapu of blood in Hawaii. After tossing the grisly remnants of his murdered watchman into the Pacific, Captain Simon Metcalfe pivoted immediately to mass murder. Standing on a manicured Ko'olina balcony on Oʻahu, watching vacationers paddleboard over protected lagoons, it takes a peculiar kind of mental gymnastics to reconcile the gentle hospitality marketed in the lobby with the scorched earth vendettas that defined these waters in the late 18th century. Today, a resort concierge might resolve a dispute with a complimentary room upgrade. Metcalfe preferred the finality of grapeshot. His decision to annihilate the villagers at Olowalu on Maui was not just about the stolen boat. It was a desperate attempt to patch the gaping leaks in his own command structure. The ship was boiling over with competing grievances. On one side, the crew, largely Portuguese or Manila men, were baying for blood and eager to avenge their killed countrymen. On the other, The ship's officers, including the boatswain John Young, possessed the radical notion that slaughtering civilians was perhaps too severe. When they pointed out that firing into a crowd would result in butchering a number of innocent women and children, Metcalfe responded with the calm rationality of a dictator sensing a coup. He accused his own officers of mutiny, claiming they intended to take the ship, and ordered them back to their stations. It was a bleak exercise in maritime management. When subordinates questioned his morality, Metcalfe resolved the debate by threatening to hang them until morale improved. Metcalfe launched his ambush with cold mercantile calculation. Following the theft and the reported ritual sacrifice of the watchman, the local chiefess Kalola had placed a kapu, a sacred restriction on the bay to freeze all activity. Metcalfe waited. He hovered off the coast like a spider in the rigging, knowing the kapu would eventually lift and the locals, believing peace had been restored, would return to trade. When the ban was finally lifted, canoes swarmed the Eleanora, driven by the resumption of commerce and the fatal assumption of safety. Metcalfe played the benevolent merchant, encouraging the vessels to cluster tightly on the starboard side. His men reportedly threw stones at canoes on the port side to herd them into position, creating a dense, inescapable target. He ordered his gunners to keep the ports closed and weapons hidden until the crowd was packed tightly enough to ensure maximum casualties. Then he gave the order. The Eleanora unleashed a broadside of cannon fire and musket volleys directly into the mass of humanity. The sea turned dark. When the initial thunder of the cannons faded, the sailors, fueled by their captain's frenzy and their own vengeance, took to the rails with small arms and boarding pikes to spear survivors in the water. It was not a battle. It was an industrial execution. From the quarterdeck, Metcalfe surveyed the carnage with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had successfully balanced the ledger. He had asserted his power, satisfied his crew's sense of justice, terrified his officers into obedience, and punished the locals for their transgression. As he ordered the Eleanora to weigh anchor and sail away, he remained fatally unaware that he had not ended the cycle of violence. He had merely spun the wheel of retaliation harder, blindly setting a trap his own son would soon sail directly into. Blood tide at Kealakekua Bay. The trap Simon had blindly set for his son did not originate with the mass murder on Maui, but from a snare laid months prior. Before shedding blood at Olowalu, Simon had anchored off Hawaiʻi Island and ordered the High Chief Kamakaʻeheikuli flogged for a minor infraction. Flogging a High Chief is not some minor cultural misunderstanding to be smoothed over with apologies. It is a declaration of war written in physical humiliation. The enraged chief swore a binding oath to kill the crew of the next foreign ship that dared enter his waters. And because history loves a grim coincidence, the next ship was not a random trader or a lost explorer. It was the Fair American, a tiny schooner commanded by Simon's 18-year-old son, Thomas Metcalf. Thomas arrived in March 1790, making landfall near Kauai on the sun-blasted Konakohala coast. He was looking for the Eleanora to regroup for the long run to China. Instead, he sailed directly into the open jaws of his father's consequences. When the schooner anchored, Kamakaʻeheikuli boarded with his warriors under the guise of trade. One could debate the sheer misfortune that guided the son into the specific bay of the chief his father had tortured, but the Pacific was simply too small to absorb that much Metcalfe hubris without violent reprisal. The answer came quickly. Thomas was thrown overboard and beaten to death. The entire crew was slaughtered, save for the oiler Isaac Davis, who was wounded but spared to become an involuntary guest of the kingdom. Kamakaʻeheikuli seized the ship, the guns, and the cargo, completing the transaction Simon had started. Geography only compounded the irony of the situation. While Thomas was being murdered, Simon was anchored roughly 30 miles away at Kealakekua Bay, pacing his quarterdeck and growing increasingly frustrated by the delay of his tender. The silence that followed was engineered by Kamehameha I, who controlled the bay where Simon waited. Understanding the extreme volatility of the crisis, Kamehameha imposed a strict kapu, a sacred prohibition on any canoes sailing out to the Eleanora. It was an absolute information blockade. When Simon's boatswain, John Young, went ashore to stretch his legs, he was promptly detained to ensure he could not carry the news of Thomas's death back to the ship. Frustrated by the sudden halt in commerce and the apparent desertion of his boatswain, Simon spent days firing signal guns. The relentless, booming artillery fire was a doomed attempt to demand answers from shores that had been ordered to give none. Receiving no response and lacking the patience or courage to investigate further, Simon raised anchor and sailed for China, leaving John Young on the beach. He departed the islands permanently, entirely unaware that the silence from the land was actually the sound of his own legacy collapsing. Simon Metcalfe's Pacific Reckoning. Deep silence settles over a bay quicker than memory does, but Kealakekua Bay seemed to hold its breath long after our antagonist's ship disappeared. It creates a strange dissonance to look out at the horizon where Simon Metcalfe sailed away in a huff, completely unaware that his tardy son Thomas had already been murdered just 30 miles up the coast. The ignorance was total. Metcalfe steered the Eleanora toward China, annoyed by a perceived lack of punctuality, unwittingly fleeing the scene of a family tragedy that had concluded without his permission. For Metcalfe, the 1790s devolved into a masterclass in catastrophic decline. Once he returned to the humid trade circuits of Macau, his commercial empire dissolved. He tried to ship his wealth back to the United States on a vessel named the Catherine, which promptly sank and dragged almost everything he owned into the abyss. Soon after, his flagship Eleanora vanished. The wooden extension of his ego and the instrument of his cruelty was likely swallowed by the Indian Ocean along with his charts, his navigation tools, and the final tangible reminders of his wife and eldest son. Stripped of his fleet and his fortune, Metcalfe was reduced to commanding the Eno, a tiny 90-ton French brig. The demotion was the maritime equivalent of trading a commanding gunship for a rotting coastal skiff. In a frantic attempt to balance his ledger, he planned an oiling voyage to the Kerguelen Islands. This archipelago is so bleak that cartographers literally labeled it Desolation Island. It is difficult to conceive of a more heavy-handed travel itinerary for a man pursued by his own bad karma than a direct ticket to desolation, but history often writes with a sledgehammer rather than a pen. Launching a sealing expedition to the bottom of the world did not make him an intrepid tycoon. It made him a shivering connoisseur of misery with nothing to show for his efforts but empty barrels. The venture was a frozen bust. He limped back to Mauritius by 1793, possessing little more than frostbite and regret. The final dismantling of the Metcalfe saga took place in 1794. He returned to the northwest coast for a fifth time, dragging his surviving younger son Robert along for the ride. The Eno dropped anchor in the Houston-Stewart Channel of Haida, Gwaii, parking directly on the doorstep of Koya, a Haida chief who possessed a very long memory and very short patience for American captains. Koya had been humiliated years earlier by a different trader named John Kendrick. Metcalfe, a man whose entire personal brand was unnecessary escalation, provided a convenient proxy for vengeance. Perhaps exhausted by a solid run of failure, or perhaps mathematically due for an error, Metcalfe allowed a massive number of Haida traders to board his tiny brig. It was a tactical blunder that mirrored the trap he had once sprung on the Hawaiians at Olowalu. The trade dissolved into a sudden swarm, and the Haida force carried the vessel with overwhelming speed. In the ensuing violence, Simon Metcalfe, his young son Robert, and nearly the entire crew were wiped out. The geometry of the retribution was precise. A single survivor, who had scrambled high into the rigging, was taken captive and eventually ransomed. In a twist of irony that feels almost scripted, this survivor was the one to carry the news of Metcalfe's death back to Hawaii in 1795. He delivered the end of the father's story to John Young, the very boatswain the father had abandoned on the shore to survive the story's beginning. Reviewing the dusty biography in the glow of my tablet, I see the historian believes Metcalfe eventually learned his eldest son had died years earlier. However, the darker corners of the internet, those vanguards of vibes-based historical revisionism, suggest he died in total ignorance. I prefer the latter interpretation. It adds a layer of poetry to the man's exit. The sea claims the debt that silence owed. And that brings us to the close of Chapter 4, Reef, Radar, and Metcalfe's Revenge. If this chapter leaves you with anything, it's that the Pacific has always been a place where small miscalculations compound, and Simon Metcalfe's story is about as cold a proof of that as history offers. A man who enforced his own rules across an ocean that kept no records of mercy and paid for it in ways he never lived to fully understand. Next time, in Chapter 5, the northwest coast of Oʻahu is back on the itinerary. There's a whale involved, and a parking lot nearly becomes its own incident. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon. The Papayas of Wrath. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join the community over on Patreon.